I conceptualize Russia as the informational autocracy. So, and that foregrounds the importance of the media for politics and everyday life today, an unprecedented importance of the media. And of course, theorists of nationalism and particularly Anderson and Gellner highlighted the importance of printed word and the media, the press at the time, to understand why nation as the concept, as a political concept, start to take shape in the modern period. But now we clearly have a very different, a new stage of what media scholars called mediatization of society. So informational autocracy is a new type, 21st century type of non-democratic regime, which is different from, say, totalitarian or authoritarian states of the 20th century, in that they modern day informational autocrats prioritize manipulation of information in order to concentrate and maintain their power over brutal force and systematic ideological indoctrination. And they do that because they can no longer control information within national borders, and because they appreciate this phenomenon of mediatization. It's not simply that the media mediate events, but it's that the core elements of political, social, cultural activity, in fact, assume media form. Putin's main advisor on communication until 2012, Vladislav Surkov, famously say that these days mediated realities replace a belief in objective realities, sort of admitting kind of the basis for his communication policy. And basically, even in politics, even in authoritarian societies, media logic can take precedent over political logic. The political logic put institutional interest, the interest of political institutions, central stage, and media logic put the interest of the media outlet, which has its commercial imperatives, but also the need to hook, to entertain, to attract audience, central stage. And so that has an impact on how political messages are communicated, and that makes the media such an important tool for instrumentalization, for staying in power, maintaining power for present-day autocrats. And we also should remember that today, what the state is, and it's something obviously which is the state building, it's flagged up in the title of the conference, what the state is very different from what it was even a few decades ago, certainly in the most part of the 20th century. Today, many activities which used to be the prerogative of the state, of state bodies, formal governmental and state bodies, are outsourced to third parties. And things related to education, also so-called state media actors, let's say in a country like Russia, some of them are not directly paid by the state, but indirectly. So the states these days are much more of a kind of network of loosely affiliated actors. And so the state-affiliated actors can have their own agendas and agencies, even in under authoritarian regime. And these agencies and agendas, let's say in Russia, of state-affiliated media actors could differ from those of the Kremlin. So that's the context. And so this is the kind of context within I'm trying to conceptualize the neo-authoritarian regime of memory. And the regime of memory, it's a kind of widely used term referring to a set of cultural and institutional practices that are designed to publicly commemorate or remember historical events. And again, my thinking on how to conceptualize a memory regime in authoritarian state such as Russia was inspired by a very good book by Michael Bernard and Jan Kubik on the politics of memory in Eastern Europe 20 years after the collapse of communism. And Bernard and Kubik came up with a classification. They identified 3 different types of memory regime. And none of these types, I thought, fitted Russia, well, largely because in all the countries discussed by Bernard and Kubik, the results of the elections were not predetermined. Even in very fragile kind of democracy such as Ukraine, one did not know who will be the winner of the elections. And so sharp fluctuations in narratives around history would usually be affiliated in those democratic states with a change of government, or there would be a contestation around historical events in the course of the elections where the contestation between political candidates in the elections is actually genuine, not staged. In Russia, since 1996, in a way, the results of the elections have been predetermined. So it's a different type, it's a clearly non-democratic polity. In my sort of presentation, of course, I take into account the fact that the elites, political elites and intellectual elites manipulate public historical memory as part of their legitimation strategy. So it's not just in authoritarian regime, but we will be talking about specific types of instrumentalization and manipulation in relation to the informational autocracy. And then another final kind of concept which I think is important for my analysis is national memory as the frame within which citizens can place events in the national history, whether or not they took part in them. And one can say that certainly since the 19th century, the political elites and intellectual elites attempted to create this frame for national memory. And certainly the authoritarian regimes of the 20th century try to do their best to create such a frame and kind of police its borders. So again, the question is what's happening with the construction of this frame in today's authoritarian regime, whose main tool is manipulation of information. And also, what of course we all have to remember in studying the politics of memory, the construction of cultural memory of the nation, is bottom-up, not just top-down initiatives of the elites, but bottom-up initiatives, and of course with the spread of education and the development of new media communication tool, the bottom-up initiatives become ever more important. And in memory studies, there is a lot of work on this bottom-up initiatives which cross national boundaries, which very often challenge the dominant top-down national memory frame. These authoritarian states, current authoritarian states based on the manipulation of information, they actually follow these grassroots initiatives and attempt to co-opt those which serve the needs of informational autocrats. For instance, in the Russian case, there is an attempt to co-opt grassroots initiatives around the memory of the Second World War into the main official narrative. But the role of the publics today, who are digitally tooled, so they can connect very easily, bypassing any official channels of communications, make the audience targeting by messages which autocrats prefer quite problematic. So these informational autocrats actually function in a very fluid environment, which they find very difficult to control. And so I think that it is in this context that we should, of fluidity and difficulty to control the information while relying on this control and manipulation, that we should explain the particular memory regime which has emerged in Russia, but I also have started to do comparative work, and there are actually similar trends in Turkey and in China. And this memory regime I tried called idiosyncratic, but I'm not sure that it's the best term. So, and what this term idiosyncratic tries to point to, tries to capture, it's unprecedented contradiction and fluctuation of official narratives about the past. So one moment, let's say during the celebrations of the the Soviet victory in the Second World War, Stalin's Soviet Union is presented as the kind of model state, and contemporary Russia is the heir to that state, so quite a positive, at least implicitly, representation of Stalin and his system in the official discourse. And then in connection with the centenary of the revolution, Stalin is degenerate, bandit, and murderer, and nothing else. So how do we explain this? So there is I would say, a minimum stability of core structural narratives, and in a lot of this informational autocracies of today, the core structural narrative is around negative representations of the West, so the so-called West as the main enemy and historical enemy of this new type of non-democratic societies, be it in China or Latin America or Russia. And there are accompanying elements of the historical narrative which fluctuate dramatically, and they fluctuate and they change under the same political leadership. The fluctuation, very significant fluctuation of a narrative about particular historical events changes not a result of, let's say, one political party losing elections and another representative, another political force coming to power in democratic democratic elections. And the fluctuation depends of the historical narrative in informational autocracy depends on the autocrat's immediate short-term needs. And again, I'm not going to go into detail, but you could see very, very clearly how the official narratives around the centenary of the revolution were directly linked to the presidential election campaign in which Putin stood as a candidate. And so within this, these unprecedented contradictions around important historical events, out of this contradiction emerges a particular instability and incoherence and abrupt changes in defining national self vis-a-vis the other. If we look at, for instance, again, Russian official discourse from 2012, in particular, when I think this memory regime start to crystallize, we'll see that various concepts of Europe, Ukraine, Islam, 1 minute it's part of Russia's self, another minute it's Russia's enemy. And again, Europe and the West in this politics of memory have been separated, differentiated. But again, the self is very unstable, and the other, the enemy, sort of constantly change. And part of the change is to kind of keep the audience hooked, keep the audience entertained, give the audience a new narrative to engage with. Sorry, I need to disconnect the phone. Sorry about that. And so these contradictory representations are periodically slotted into the state narrative about the past, as required by the changing domestic or international goals of the regime. Hence, very different, for instance, coverage of the revolution by RT for international audiences and by state television channels, domestic state television channels for domestic audience. And these changes occur, which is important, under the same political elite. So the term, for instance, fractured memory regime, which Bernard and Kubik introduced in relation to societies where there is significant polarization in perceptions of history between political parties. And so if one political party replaces the other in government, there is a shift. Here we have shifts, drastic shifts under the same elite. And so, of course, all political elites try to instrumentalize history for achieving their own goals. But the levels of instrumentalization, I would say, on the part of these informational autocracies is unprecedented. And it's because they rely so much on the manipulation of information, and because this manipulation, the way they kind of rule through manipulation of information, means that basically their goals are very short term. And so there is an absence of an overarching broad national memory frame. And various scholars of memory politics in Russia, for instance, like Olga Malinova, have emphasized that. But I'm trying to explain in my conceptualization of this idiosyncratic memory regime, I'm trying to explain why we have this absence of broad national memory frame. And then, again, I would urge those who study the construction of the cultural memory of the nation to pay attention to the role of the media existing in that particular historical period, and to treat the media not just as a source of information about the politics of memory, but as a force in its own right, the media as a constitutive element in the construction of the memory regime. And we can see that now the various, particularly digital and social media platforms have their own way of communication, their own style of communication. And it has a very, very major effect on even traditional media. And there is a particular term coined by Rogers Brubaker on populist stylistic repertoire, which actually influences the way very established mainstream politicians in Western democracies utilize. But in these informational autocracies, this populist communication style reigns supreme. So on the main state channels, in television channels in Russia, in discussing serious historical events, in commemorating historical events, low style of communication prevails, which is in a way unusual. So, and there is a tendency to break taboos, to use irony, to rely on conspiracy theories, and of course appeal to emotions. So these programs about the 1917 revolution were focused on scandals around sex. They were dominated by conspiracy theories, and again, the kind of low level, low style of language was also used, unusual for kind of supposedly serious historical programs compared to the style of communication in such programs in the past. So to conclude, I would say that if we try to conceptualize a particular memory regime, we should relate it to a political system and their democracies and non-democracies sort of differ in terms of their use of historical memory. We now see new ways of instrumentalizing the past, and these informational autocrats offer us these new examples of instrumentalizing the past for short-term gains at the expense of articulating or supporting an overarching national memory frame. So one might argue that the promotion of a coherent community building through coherent history-related narratives might not be desirable for informational autocrats who might fear that an opposition leader would come along and use that national memory frame more effectively than the autocrat can do. And indeed, again, in the Russian context, this Alexei Navalny, of course, the main opposition leader, attempted to use a particular national narrative against Putin. We should, in studying the cultural memory of the nation, how it's constructed in a particular place, in a particular time, pay attention to the communication modes associated with that particular period. And the means of communication, the very media, actually influence the way national memory is constructed and presented to the public, and the ways the public engages with the construction of national memory. And finally, I would say that this idiosyncratic memory regime is a weakness for informational autocrat long-term. It might be beneficial short-term, but long-term it deprives the informational autocrat from a very important societal consensus management tool. And I'll stop at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sincerely, to colleague Vera, perhaps you should.
Yeah.
You have set a few challenging contemporary social questions, no doubt. I found that point of the emotionalization of the contemporary media, comparing it with our studies of myths, for example, of the stories, of the tales. No? We are quite in the same position, but in the other times, I can say. Okay, now we have some minutes for discussion. I opened the discussion and called discutants. Pal Costo, I see that he is ready for a discussion. Please, dear colleague Paul.
Hi Vera, nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Paul.
So, a very interesting talk, I must say. And I heard quite a few new ideas, and I guess I have to digest it before I really can sort of take it in. Your title had a question, right? Either nation building or regime legitimation. Is there an either or here, or isn't there are sort of isn't it typical of autocratic regimes that they try to eradicate any distinction between the regime and the state, and to support the regime is to be sort of a patriot, and of course Putin himself has said that patriotism is the national idea of Russia. But also the point that you said that the story they are telling is fragmented and contradictory. Yes, for us, I guess, scholars who can see through the propaganda, you can, or but is this how it is perceived by the public as a sort of a postmodern hodgepodge? I just finished Marlene's book on the cultural memory of the Civil War, and which she co-authored with another. And the idea there seems to be that yes, the Reds were right; they were patriots, and the Whites were right; they were also patriots, all in their own way. So they only, but some of them were misled by some Westerners, and also for Vladimir Medinsky, it's the same message that everything that went wrong previously was due to some Westerners or some foreigners trying to exploit the bad situation for Russia, so which can also, of course, be transposed to the contemporary situation. Everyone who has links to the West are bad. So there is my feeling is that yes, you have it here. So you can negatively call it a hotspot, or it's a smorgasbord where everybody can sort of help themselves to the part of history which they like, but I had the feeling that the message coming from the Kremlin is that there is a Jedini Patok. There is the Russian history is one seamless story, in spite of everything. But maybe when having listened to you, I started, maybe there's something I missed there. So.
Paul is always very excellent sort of questions and issues. Where I would say, yes, there is no kind of either or, either legitimation or nation building. But what I was sort of reacting to is that there is almost a default assumption that elites, and certainly in the Russian context, they evoke history, they try to articulate narratives around history and use kind of cultural memory for nation-building purposes. So that is kind of a default. Of course, they also try to legitimize, but there is this nation-building imperative and goal. And sort of my argument is that there isn't a nation-building imperative or goal necessarily. So we should kind of acknowledge the importance, not necessarily only in the context of this informational autocracy, but other probably political systems, that there could be sort of attempts at using history for legitimation purposes of the regime, which has nothing to do with community building, consensus management, nation building, or state building. It's about power maintenance, yeah? Also, I think it's kind of Peter Rutland argued that there is a sort of difference between identity maintenance and nation building. And again, identity maintenance is kind of short-term, fits with short-term legitimation goals of the autocrat, for instance. And I think that would be, again, to kind of make my analysis more complete, one needs to look at history textbooks, because that's, of course, key. It's not occasional sort of programs on state television, whose aim is, yes, to maybe disseminate political messages, but largely it's to entertain the public. And so that would be kind of that needs to be factored into kind of attempt to theorize particular memory regime of this informational autocracy. And then, yes, there are definitely core messages which this informational autocracy or neo-authoritarian states promote, and they have to have these core messages, because without that, of course, it's very difficult to kind of maintain authority. And anti-Westernism is kind of everywhere, or also additional, and that's what impacted on the coverage of the revolution, is that, let's say, Putin's regime is for stability, revolution is bad. Stability is good. But still, let's say if we take kind of 19th century narratives of official narratives of history in different places, or 20th century, including the Soviet one, you could more or less, let's say, predict how a particular event will be commemorated. Of course, when, let's say, Stalin died, there was a change of discourse. Yes, but that's a change of leadership. Then with a change of leadership, you have a change of discourse, let's say movement from collective leadership after Lenin's death to Stalin in the 1930s, major change in historical discourse, but it's a change of political leadership. Here, under the same leadership, you can't predict how they're going to deploy while maintaining this anti-Westernism as an important frame, or this единый поток, as you say, the kind of 1,000 years of Russian history, how they would commemorate a specific event. You cannot predict, and you had Sheila Fitzpatrick writing, Mark Ellerly, and they were completely wrong about their prediction. And you thought that this conciliation and accord frame, which Marlene discusses in relation to the coverage of the Civil War, they thought it will be used, and it wasn't. So yeah, this is unusual, I think, and needs kind of conceptualization or theorizing. Well, thank you. Yeah, it's very important kind of questions and potential critique of kind of my ideas. Yeah.
But just a small follow-up. The various epithets they use about the regime. I mean, isn't it correct that if they say Bolsheviks, then that's the early Soviet period? The Bolsheviks were bad, but the Soviets are good.
Yes, but
even though they're same people.
Yeah. But again, there were nothing good in this. I don't know whether you watched this remarkable programs on Channel 1 in Russia, and there was nothing good even about the Soviets.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not even Brezhnev time?
No. The good was Nicholas II.
Yeah.
And early 20th century Russian Empire.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you both. Yes, these are really the challengings of the methodology of cultural memory, I think. So we are discussing about the history of the contemporary society. We see how these approaches of the interests, as you say, of the power maintenance or of the nation or building, nation or state buildings are imposed to the people, and these are the interests, I think so, of our studies, historians, and from the other social and humanities disciplines. Okay, I now give a word to my dearest colleague Gorazd Bajić, who also have prepared some questions. Please, Gorazd.
Okay, thank you, Darko. Thank you for all. Hvala lepa. I have a question for my colleague Andrej Rahten. Imam vprašanje za Andreja Rahtena. Najprej tudi bi čestital za zelo zanimivo predavanje. Pravzaprav sintetizirati v tako kratkem času ni bilo lahko, je pa bilo učinkovito, Andrej. Se slišiva? Pozdravljam. To, kar si omenil, to pismo januarja leta 1919 Vidmarja, Josipa Vidmarja, me zanima, če je morda kdaj Vidmar, ali pa recimo to je lahko samo neka sugestija, kdaj se nekako spominjal tega, ali je to pozabil, ali je to nekako vrgel stran, ne fizično, pa vendar ne. Skratka, če je kakšna raziskava v tej smeri bila še opravljena, ali pa morda bi lahko bila še opravljena, iskanje tega, ker enkrat je treba pa vendarle pričeti z idejami, recimo, bomo rekli o samostojnosti, o takšni viziji, potem lahko tudi se zadevo pozabi. Znamenita številka 57 nove revije ni lahko branje, kot dobro vemo, je pa bilo treba enkrat to napisati in objaviti, dati na papir. Tisto branje, če je kdo bral, je zelo pomembno, ni pa čisto jasno in povsem definitivno tam ni izpovedano vse tisto, kar morda si kdo misli, da je bilo takrat napisano. Je pa treba enkrat to tudi začeti. Skratka, morda, če poznaš kaj več o tem, ali pa recimo, če vidiš ti kot možnost, da bi se lahko v tej smeri kakšno dodatno raziskavo, ker če rečeš, da je ta dokument nekako prišel skoraj bolj slučajno na dan, pred nekaj leti, je lahko tudi še kakšen drugi. Ali pa kakšni spomini, še neobjavljeni.
Ja, hvala Gorazd za vprašanje. Moram reči, da sem pričakoval nekaj podobnega. Res je, v bistvu takoj, ko sem to pismo odkril pred 2 letoma in pol v Arhivu Republike Slovenije v fondu, ki ga ti poznaš celo bolje kot jaz, torej fondu nekdanjega Inštituta za narodnostna vprašanja, sem bil presenečen iz 2 razlogov. Prvič, ker doslej še nihče vseh pregledih tega res izjemno pomembnega fonda ni postal pozoren na to pismo. In drugič, ker sem potem žal moral ugotoviti, da ta Josip Vidmar ni zapustil, vsaj po mojih tistih preliminarnih raziskavah, nič drugega za sabo. Jaz sem poskušal preko povezav, ki jih ima Petra Svoljšak, nekako priti do teh seznamov, teh beguncev. Ker najprej sem tudi jaz razveselil, pa sem si mislil, da je to ta Josip Vidmar.
Razumem, ja.
Žal ni on. Če bi bil on, bi bila to senzacija, o kateri bi verjetno nastal poseben simpozij in bi mogel Darko Darovec organizirati še najmanj eno okroglo mizo. Ampak dejstvo je, da sem potem seveda poskušal najti tega begunca. In žal, do sedaj, kar smo uspeli in kar je tudi Petra poizvedovala, nismo prišli do njega. Vse, kar je znano, je to, da je dobil prižališče nekje v bližini Novega mesta, potem, ko je moral nekako se omakniti iz okupirane teritorije. Tako da žal nimamo več od tega. Zdaj, jaz upam in zato vedno znova ponavljam na teh predavanjih, ki jih imam, morda še kdo, ki je kaj podobnega v njem našel, in to bi bilo res izjemno velika stvar. In mislim, da je naša skupna naloga, in tukaj bi se zdaj vrnil glavni poanti tvojega vprašanja, da gremo proč od tisočletnih sanj in da poskušamo pa vendarle kot zgodovinarji pokazati na tiste momente, ki jih v teh šablonah nekako ne najdemo. Jaz moram povedati, da včasih se čudim, kako eni ponastavljajo slovenski vstop v Jugoslavijo in živijo neki romantiki, ki je daleč od realnosti. Po drugi strani pa spet vidim eno osnovno elementarno nepoznavanje torej glavnih motivov za odločitev Slovencev, za prvo odločitev za Jugoslavijo, če nekako citiram najbolj slavno delo na to temo pokojnega akademika Pleterskega. Tako da jaz tukaj nekako trkaš na odprta vrata, lahko rečem, naša naloga je, in ravno taki projekti, kot je ta, zato sem se razveselil vabila na ta projekt o gradnikih, so tista priložnost, ker morda lahko zdaj po 100 letih še morda kaj novega odkrijemo in presežemo te stereotipe, s katerimi so nas učili že praktično od vrtca dalje. Hvala za vprašanje, Gorazd.
Hvala tebi, podpišem, kar si rekel. Hvala.
Aleš Maver se je oglasil, kolega Aleš Maver, prosim.
Ja, pozdravljeni, čestitke vsem za referate. Tudi moje vprašanje bi bilo pa za dr. Andreja Rahtena In sicer zahvaljujem se mu za to natančno predstavitev vseh alternativ, ki so obstajale ob koncu Prve svetovne vojne, ker se mi zdi, da to vprašanje res prihaja v ospredje. Sam sem recimo delal primerjavo z Ukrajinci, ki niso imeli na vzhodu nobene nacionalne infrastrukture, pa so takoj šli v izgradnjo države, ki se je sicer potem sfižila in imela katastrofalne posledice. Slovenci pa torej imajo vso nacionalno infrastrukturo, pa niti poskusa neke širše nacionalne avtonomije po Prvi svetovni vojni ni. In to je seveda verjetno nas vodi do ugotovitve, da je šlo za choice, se pravi izbiro brez alternative dejansko na terenu. Me pa zanima, kdo je bil motor tega hitrega obrata od sicer tradicionalnega zavezništva s Hrvati potem do nekritičnega sprejemanja srbskega okvira in patronata, ki ga prej tako rekoč v zgodovinskih vizijah ni. Ali je to bila pobuda terena ali pa je to bila odločitev politične elite, po tvojem mnenju?
Hvala, Aleš. To je izjemno pomembno vprašanje. Jaz mislim, da je to celo prelomno vprašanje, ki ga moramo upoštevati, ne? Kajti brez odgovora na to vprašanje ne moremo razumeti, zakaj je pravzaprav prišlo do tiste prve odločitve Slovencev za Jugoslavijo. Jaz lahko seveda rečem v tem kontekstu, da je seveda zanimivo vprašanje kot prvo, ne, zakaj pride do tistega obrata, ne, obrata, ki se ga ti lepo opisal, proč od hrvaško-slovenskega zavezništva v neko prosrbsko držo. In drugič, zakaj pravzaprav potem ni na obzorju ali pa ni v teh odločitvah nobene alternative, ne. Jaz mislim, da sta razloga povezana. Zdaj, kot prvo, moramo se zavedati, da je tisto, kar je prioriteta, prerogativa slovenske politike v tistem času, je zavarovanje tako imenovanih, bi rekel, narodnih mej, ne. Zdaj, kaj to pomeni, ne? To pomeni, da seveda moramo imeti pred očmi, da je bila zunanja politika prioritetnega pomena. Torej, tisto, kar se zaveda slovenska politična elita, je, da je treba narediti vse, da se ta usodni trenutek oblikovanja narodnih meja ne zamudi. In seveda, to pa je bilo možno doseči samo na način, in to je povezava z drugim delom vprašanja. Torej, kako naj Slovenci, za katere praktično nihče v tistem času ni vedel, kakor je celo Finžgar zelo pretirano piše, ampak deloma to drži, a ne? Kako naj nek narod, ki, kot si rekel, je imel vso nacionalno infrastrukturo izoblikovano, kako lahko ta narod potem seveda sploh doseže, bi rekel, oblikovanje nekega svojega državnopravnega cilja. In seveda odgovor je bil tu zelo preprost. Samo z navezavo na državo, ki je bila takrat v tistem okolju, v tistem prostoru edina, ki je sodila v zavezniški krog zmagovalnih sil Prve svetovne vojne. In navezava na Kraljevino Srbijo je seveda v prvi vrsti, in tu je ta primat zunanje politike, lahko rečemo, da so Slovenci odlični učenci Rankeja, a ne, ki potem oblikuje tudi njihovo stališče do te, bi rekel, izrazito prosrbske drže, in ne samo to, ki izoblikuje tudi izrazito unitaristično formulo njihovega pojmovanja slovenskega narodnega bivanja v tistem prehodnem času. Zdaj, seveda se te stvari potem zelo hitro obrnejo, danes smo omenili tisto prelomnico z avtonomistično izjavo, ampak čas tranzicije, čas postimperialne tranzicije ne pušča možnih alternativ, razen teh, ki sem jih sedaj izpostavil.
Najlepša hvala za to diskusijo. Thanks to all discutants for your interventions. I propose now that we have a break, lunch break, and that we will see at the 14:30. So from more than an hour we have a break time. Torej, če naj povem po slovensko, predlagam, da sedaj naredimo pauzo za kosilo in se potem ob 14:30 zopet srečamo pri nadaljevanju naše konference. Sicer pa, ja?
Hvala za informacijo, gremo jesti.
Ja. Sicer pa bo čas potem tudi še po koncu današnjega dne, ne, da bomo lahko tudi odprli kakšne diskusije na dopoldanske prispevke. V redu?
Okay.
Dober tek.
Ja, hvala. Thanks to all. We will see you from an hour.